In this lesson, we're going to create a scene where we're going to take objects, bomb objects, and make them collide with other objects. And upon their collision, they're going to emit a sprite object with an animated texture map of an explosion. So this is kind of got just a preview here on the bottom of what's going on in the scene. And the main camera hasn't been calculated for the alpha planes to be facing the camera, so those are a little stretched out, but you can see on the bottom kind of the result of what's happening. So the bomb particles are dropping onto the ground, and once they die basically, or hit the ground, the collision, they die, and then they emit an alpha plane, or billboard object, with an animated texture map. So we're going to take a look at setting up the particles for this, and also how to set up the texture map, because we do need to use the particles' birth time to control when the animation starts. Because otherwise what's going to happen with the texture map is they're going to play with the timeline and start at 0, continue to play, and then loop themselves, and the explosions won't show up correctly. So I'm going to start in a fresh scene, and I'm going to first create the particle object and set up the texture map, the animated texture map, for the explosion. I'm going to go ahead and add an alpha plane object, or billboard object. We can turn on the billboard in the object itself, or we can use the particle functions to keep it facing the camera, which I think is what I'm going to do. So what I want to do, and I want to note that the animated texture map I'm going to load in is something I cannot include with the training because it is a licensed explosion, and it is from a company called Artbeats. So if you do want to completely follow along, you are going to have to purchase the animation, the video sequence from Artbeats in order to use it, or you can use your own content if you have your own explosions or any other sort of animated map. So I'm going to go ahead and click to load, and I'm going to browse file, and I already have this set up, and this is for the alpha, so I just need to go to the color folder. So I'm going to load in my color sequence. I'm also going to override the gamma to 1. I believe the scene itself should be in a gamma of 1, but if you want to set this up for a different gamma, you can do that too, depending on the map you need. I'm going to keep mine at 1 and go ahead and click open. And now it's going to ask if I'd like to load in the entire sequence, because it does detect the numbers at the end. I'm going to click yes. And then I'm going to load in a separate sequence for the alpha to cut it out, basically the transparency. So just starting frame 1, and I'm going to override the gamma, open, and select yes for the sequence. And then I'm also going to invert the alpha, because with view, black is going to be what shows through. Click OK. And now I can hit F11 on the keyboard to open up the timeline. And if we start to scrub through, we're going to see that explosion happening. Now, this sequence is not square. The images are not square. So what we need to do is adjust the size to match. And what we need is a ratio of 16 by 9. We can just cut that in half, because the 9 for the y is already cut in half, so we can just go ahead and change that to 8 for the x. And now we'll have the correct scale set up for the explosion. So we also need, when you're working with anything that's luminous like this, we do need to go into the material, and I'm going to go ahead and set the material name to explosion. And we're going to go over to the Effects tab, making sure you're in the Advanced Material Editor, and remove diffusion and ambience and set it to 100% luminous. And that's just going to show the texture map itself, with no shading from the lighting, so it's not going to depend on the lighting at all. And we can scrub through, and we won't see a preview in the OpenGL, but we can see it showing up here as we kind of scrub through and render. So now what we need to do is set this up to be dependent on particles and based on the particle birth. So we're going to go into the explosion material and we're going to edit the function. And what we're going to modify is the phase. We also want to make sure that we have the frame rate set correctly. And when you're working with particles, the best thing to do is really work with a frame rate of 25. And actually, in this case, it doesn't really matter because we're not going to be using the scene. So I don't really need to go into the animation options for the scene and set it to 25. But I am going to keep the frame rate at 25. So what we need to do is set up a little bit of a function here that we can, or a meta node we can create to be able to reuse over and over for animation maps on different particles. And the first thing we're going to start out with is adding an input node, and we're going to go to the particle birth time, and we want to turn off parametric, and this is going to give us the actual time within the timeline when the particle is created. So what we want to do is take that point and make it the beginning of the animation, and this is going to be calculated per particle so that every animation for the texture map in each particle will start at its birth. So first what we need to do is set this up for the phase. The phase, if you look in the view manual, it does say that it is based on seconds. It is not. It is a parametric phase input. Is basically 0 to 1 is going to equal the full length of the animation. So if we set it to 1, it is the same as setting it to 0. It is not based on seconds, even though the manual says it is. So that is one thing I'd like to clear up. So what we need to do is convert this to be set up for the phase in a parametric output. So what we need are two things. The frame rate. So we're going to go ahead and create a constant node, set it to constant number, and set it to 25. So that's our frame rate. And we're going to add another constant node, and we need to set this to the amount of frames in the animation. Now, since we're starting at frame 1, we don't need to subtract or add anything. Some animations are going to start with frame 0, so you need to make sure you include that, depending on what your last number is in the sequence. So there's 270 frames in this because there's no frame 0. So what we're going to do is set this up to 270, and I'm going to add in a combiner node and set it to divide, and we're going to take and connect input 0 to the total amount of frames and divide that by the frame rate. So this is going to basically convert this to seconds. And that is because our particle birth time is going to be dependent on seconds, not based on frames. And pretty much all animation view, when working with time inputs, is all based on seconds. So we just have to convert. So now we have an output here, the amount of seconds. And what I also need to do is add just one more filter after this calculation here and set it to opposite. And we do need a negative number. And then what we're going to do is add one more combiner node and set it to divide. And then we're going to take the particle birth time and divide it by the total amount of seconds in the animation as a negative. And then we can connect the phase to that output. And we can do that for both animation maps. So for the alpha, the transparency output, and also the color output. And this is going to ensure that when the particle is created, the animation starts at the birth time of the particle itself. Now, there's just one more feature we can add to this setup, and you can create a meta node out of this current setup, but because there's no frame zero, what can sometimes happen, and it really doesn't even matter if there's a frame zero, it can just depend on the animation itself. Sometimes what can happen is you need to offset by 1 frame in order for the animation to start at the correct frame. Sometimes it'll start with the last frame and just be off by 1 total frame. So what we need to do is set up 1 offset to equal a frame. Now, because we have a parametric output, we just need to set up 1 more little set of nodes here. So what I'm going to do first is just add in a filter and set it to offset. And then we're going to connect this offset to another setup, which is going to be the combiner node set to divide, and we're going to need 2 of them. And I'm also going to add another one, which is going to subtract 1 from the other. So for input 1, the second, which we're dividing by, what we need is a constant number set to 1. And we're going to use 1 divided by the total amount of frames. And what we also need is a value we're going to change, which is going to be our offset. We can set how many frames we want to offset the animation start point by. So I'm going to add another constant, and we'll change this to a connectable constant. And I'm just going to put 1 in for now. And I'm going to just name this index. And that way we can sort of search the frame index and then output the offset for it. And what we're going to do then is basically the same thing. Take that number and divide it by the total frame rate, and then subtract that. And then connect our offset to that number. So now we should be set to go. And what we can do is just go ahead and click OK, OK again. And if you want, you can adjust the size of this object in the explosion. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it how it is, make it kind of big, and save the object in your particle directory. I'm also going to incorporate my texture maps and compress the file. And of course, once again, I can't include this because I cannot include the texture map because of licensing. And I'm just going to name this Z explosion just so it puts it at the end of the list. I can find it because I do have quite a few particles in my directory. So now that's saved, and what we can do is set up the rest of the scene. And I do want to make a quick note. I did save with the incorporated texture map. So what it's going to do is take the entire animation sequence and I think save that with the object. That may not be something you want to do. Right now it's taking a while to save that, and it's going to be a rather large file. So I think what I'm going to end up doing is resaving it with the texture maps, so they're not incorporated. And it's just going to grab them from my hard drive from the directory which I loaded them from when I load in the object as a particle. And I think that's going to be a better way to go, because otherwise it's going to be a very large file, and I really don't need a duplicate. So I am going to go ahead and resave the object, ZExplosion2, turn off incorporated texture maps, and resave it. And now it's saved instantly. And it's just going to use a link rather than incorporating the map. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete the object and just set up a plane. And this is going to be the emitter. And just raise that up above the ground plane. We're going to edit the material, change it to ecosystem particles, and we're first going to add in an object. And I'm going to use my bomb. I have a bomb object. Turn to particle motion. And I'm going to turn off the fast population mode. And now we've got a lot of different sized bombs being generated. And actually, it looks like because of the scale, it may not be creating this correctly. And that's because I think I was working in a different internal unit. We'll go ahead and try that again. And what I'm going to do is change this to the smooth shaded view so I can see them. Take the density and bring it down to 1 for the emission flow. Maybe 0.2. We don't need maybe 0.5 because we should have quite a few at this point. I'm going to bring it up to 2. And then I'm going to go over to the particle object itself. I'm going to remove any of the variable scaling. I'm going to change the scale to 0.1, recompute, and then also go to Scaling and Orientation tab and change the maximum size variation to 0, because I want them all to be the same size. Okay, so what I can also do is scale up the object to increase the surface area, recompute. And now we've got bombs that we can drop. And what I'm going to do is select the ground plane and enable collisions so that when these hit the ground, they will collide. Right now they're just kind of sticking in. I also want to set up animation for this plane, and what I'm going to do is just move the plane across the screen a little bit. So setting the object over here, we're going to add a position keyframe to the object. I'm going to go to the animation tab and set it to basic, and then just move it over 10 seconds. Move it across the screen, add a position keyframe. And now they shouldn't really be moving too much afterwards, so I might need to adjust a couple of things here, recompute. But for the most part, when they hit the ground, I do want them to explode and we won't see the object anymore. So we don't really need to deal with that too much. So what I want to do, edit the material for this plane, and we're going to die on collision. So once they hit the ground, they're going to die, and then they're going to emit. the explosion. So explosion 2, the one I saved, that was not incorporated textures, and then we're going to set it to always face the camera. Now, with the way these are being emitted upon the collision, we've got a little bit of a variable setup that we're going to need to remove. So we go to collision, and you can see the count is either 1.5 or 0.5, so it's going to be a little variable. What I want to do is change the count to 1 with no variable. So just 1, and it may do this per second. And another thing we need to set up is the time frame for the explosion. Because what's going to happen is it's going to generate the particle and emit, and then once the animation is finished, it's going to repeat the animation. So in other words, we'll have an explosion, it'll die out, fizzle, and then it'll replay that animation because the particle is still alive. So what we need to do is kill the particle at the time and the length of the animation. So what we need to do is just calculate how long the lifetime is. So 270 frames is the total animation, and we're going to divide that by the frame rate, which is 25. So that's going to be a 10-second or 10.8 second animation. So what we need to make sure is happening is that the particles are not living past 10.8. So if we have a little variability, we need to make sure that the first number plus the second doesn't go past that number. So we're going to go back into the material for the particles. We're going to go to that Z explosion 2, go to death, and set up the life duration. And what I'm going to do is set this to 9 and 1. So that way it's 10 seconds at the most, 8 seconds minimum. Most of the animation after halfway or a little over halfway, it's mostly just kind of sparks. You really won't see them. We could also fade them out. Over time, you could use opacity variations to do that. We could also set up a life size variation if we want them to grow. But I think I'm going to stick with it like this, the way it is. And we can just start to see the animation showing. And now the explosions are kind of moving around a little bit, and that might be related to the bomb object kind of moving around. So what I want to do is just manipulate something here. We're going to go to the bomb object and set up adhesion. And I'm going to see if that makes it stick to the plane object. Sometimes it'll just stick to the emitter object and not what it's colliding with. And maybe the best thing to do is just cut down the mass of the object. Another thing, actually, is this might be related to the velocity. If we go to the collision tab for the bomb, the velocity is set up. We do want to remove velocity so that it is not going out in any direction. We just want it to kind of stick where it's at. And there we go. Now it's just going to keep the explosions where the bomb hits. And if we want to set it up so maybe we're a couple more seconds into the animation, for the explosion, we can go into the object material, and then that index, we could set it up to a different frame, because sometimes there might be a little bit of a delay in the animation, maybe a couple of frames before the explosion itself shows up. And since the bomb is disappearing when it hits, we do want to have the explosion basically starting. So I could set this up to 3, maybe just go in 3 frames before it starts. And that would correct that. So what we could also do is set up additional billboards if you wanted. You could set some up with smoke. And another thing you'll notice is because the explosion takes place in the center of the frame on the texture map, the explosions are happening above the ground. And that's because when they're created, they are not created from the pivot point, which would be the center of the object. They are generated from the bottom, as if they were like using the drop object command and sort of resting on the ground. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind, is you may need to increase the scale of it, maybe mess around with the collisions a little bit, or adjust the texture map itself to maybe go a little lower in the frame, or use a different type of texture map that has more of a ground type of explosion. It does hover a little bit, which is kind of weird from this angle, but if we were to look at it from above, it would look a little better. So that's just a neat way to use particles and sprites with animated texture maps and have a little more control over the object. What I've already done is created a meta node that is going to be included with the training in the meta node folder, project content directory. And I have mine added into my texture map nodes, meta nodes, and it's called particle phase control. And that has total frames in the sequence you can type in the frame rate, and then the desired frame in the sequence is that offset. So if you want to offset the output, and it does have a couple of different outputs. So if I was to add a constant, connectable constant, what we can do is just take a look at the outputs by connecting. The phase is just that particle birth time divided by the total frame rate, or the total amount of frames divided by the frame rate. The indexed result is that parametric calculation to find out whatever the offset amount is that you've typed in. And then the phase offset by index, that is going to be the phase calculation offset by the amount of frames you want to jump into the animation from. So basically the way we have it set up here is just this one has a little bit of a different setup. So if we go inside the meta node and take a look, you can see the phase is just that basic setup with the FPS and the total amount of frames without this offset. So that is a separate. So if you want to offset by that index amount, you can set that up too. So it's a nice little meta node to have for this kind of an effect. So that is included with the training, and you can use that for your own content and your own animated sequences.